I went back to some Adam Smith. This is an old, trusty, everyone's library copy of The Wealth of Nations. And it's well thumbed. It's not quite the original, but it just about might as well be the original. And I had a look through, had a reading of it. And if you look at Adam Smith, essentially what you see is that there are about 6 key themes in terms of how he imagines the economy operating today. Sorry, how he imagines the economy operating in general. Just trying to get online. 1 second. There we go. Technology is wonderful until it's not. There we go. Yeah, so 6 key themes that shape his vision of how economics work, his vision of how free market economics works. First concept is that people matter. People matter. Sounds very obvious. But remember, the very first book that he wrote was not Wealth of Nations, but The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And in that book, he teased out the concept of what he called the mutual sympathy of sentiments. You might call it empathy today. But Adam Smith believed that the mutual sympathy of sentiments, people mattered. And it's worth putting that out because, as I'll explain in a minute, that's often been forgotten by economists and bankers with their models. Second concept that he very much runs through his writing is that government matters, or rather, judicial systems matter. He points out that essentially the way you have the invisible hand working, the way you have a market system working, is to make sure that you have some regulations and control. In fact, he actually wrote that the interests of manufacturers and merchants in any particular branch of trade or manufactures is always, in some respects, different from and even opposite to that of the public. The proposal of any new law or regulation of commerce which comes from this order ought to always be listened to with great precaution and ought never be adopted till after having been long and carefully examined. I.e., he thought that you needed to have people who were essentially overseeing what business, companies, etc. were doing. Third key point. Money is not an end in itself, but a means to an end. When he talked about banking, when he talked about money and finance, he very much saw that as being something which was going to make the wider economy healthy. He wrote, "It is not by augmenting the capital of the country, but by rendering a greater part of that capital active and productive than would otherwise be so, that the most judicious operations of banking can increase the industry of the country." Fourth point. He worked on the assumption that people who wanted to take part in commerce, the market, should be able to. That essentially markets worked best when you had people able to buy and sell and enter that business fairly freely. In fact, he actually thought it should happen across borders fairly freely, but we'll leave that aside right now because of Donald Trump. But for the most part, he thought free access was important. He thought you should be able to see the prices of things. In fact, he assumed that you could see the prices of things because that was part of a market. And he recognized that sometimes businesses kept prices artificially high, but he thought it worked best when prices were visible. And last but not least, he thought that markets worked best when you had essentially an elision of interest between managers and the people who owned companies or businesses. I mean, in some ways that was very obvious because he was writing at a time when the main businesses that were driving the economy and the business sector were essentially family-owned firms, family-owned farmed, artisanal workshops. But he took it for granted that the people running things also had a stake in them. Now, you might say, well, that's very, very obvious. You know, we all think that money should be a means to an end, not an end in itself. It obviously makes sense when you've got markets that you can see the prices and you can enter the market. It obviously makes sense to have regulators or legal framework providing some kind of oversight. But the reason why it's interesting is that if you stop and think back to the period in finance before 2007, what always amazes me is that having looked at Wall Street, having looked at the City of London, almost all of those basic principles were actually absent to a greater or lesser extent from the way that the financial system was constructed. I mean, think for a moment about the question of people matter, empathy. I mean, I spent a lot of time when I was at the Financial Times going around to banking conferences, looking at all these flashy models and algorithms that bankers were devising to talk about the products and the markets, and they almost never had a person in them. There was an extraordinary sense of divorce in terms of what finance was doing from the end result of what society was actually up to. Or think for a moment about the issue of regulation and governments. I mean, Alan Greenspan professes himself to be a huge fan of Adam Smith. He actually said at one stage that he regarded Adam Smith as having been one of the biggest intellects ever in the course of economics. And yet Alan Greenspan also represented a time when many people believed that finance essentially should be self-governed. You didn't want too much government regulation meddling in the operations of finance or markets because it was better to rely on bankers' self-interest and their own self-correction abilities, supposedly. Or if you think about the issue of pricing, which I find fascinating. When I first started covering finance for the Financial Times in 2005, I started writing about credit derivatives and credit markets, and I was stunned to discover that I couldn't get basic prices for many of the contracts, many of the instruments. If you wanted to get a price of what's called a credit default swap, I had to call up a bank and beg for the price. And if you were, say, a new financial startup who thought, hey, I'd quite like to jump into the CDS market and place a few bets myself or be a broker, you couldn't do it. It was very tightly controlled in terms of the access. Or think about the issue of shareholders and managers, or rather owners and managers. In theory, big banks, big companies are owned by shareholders. In fact, they're probably owned by you lot in the audience if any of you have got pensions or mutual funds or savings or whatever else. And yet in practice, when you talk to shareholders and ask them, did you have any idea what the managers in those banks were doing before 2007? They'd almost certainly go, no. In fact, half the time, the managers didn't know what was actually happening in the banks either. But there was a real sense of divorce between people managing and people who actually owned. So, as I say, in almost every sense, when you look at Wall Street and the City of London, and you look at the fact they were operating under the flag of Adam Smith, and yet, in many ways, not living up to those principles, you realize that there was something of an intellectual conceit at the very heart of it all. Now, I did say some of you are thinking, well, that was 10 years ago, why is she banging on about the financial crisis? That was a whole decade ago, a lot has passed. Surely we've had big financial reforms now, surely we don't have to worry about this anymore. And in some respects, that's true, because in the decade since the financial crisis happened, there have been quite a lot of changes. Prices. Good news is that these days, if any of you are seized by a sudden urge to rush out of this tent and find out a CDS price, you can. Don't all rush at once. You can actually get it online. Transparency has come to many corners of the financial markets. To a certain degree, if you want to enter some of these markets, you can do more easily as well. The government recognizes that there needs to be more regulation. In fact, since 2008 and 2009, there's been almost non-stop regulatory reform, wave after wave after wave, much of which looks pretty tedious to ordinary people, i.e. non-bankers, but it's actually been pretty significant. Sadly, I think some of it's been the wrong regulation, but it is there. These days, the banks themselves recognize, most financiers recognize, they need to have a much better sense of being embedded in society. They need to be thinking about the end results of what they're doing. They need to be aware of the social contract. That is absolutely there inside most banks when they talk about their business. And yes, some of it's lip service. Yes, some of it's trying to fob off irritating journalists like the Financial Times. But there is some shift in mindset. And some shareholders, some big shareholding groups, are now aware of the fact that they need to take a good hard look at what's happening inside companies. And yet, as so often, for every step forward, there's one step back, or one step round the sideways. Because what's remarkable is that as memory of the crisis ebbs, there are plenty of signs that some of the bad old ways are creeping back into the system. I mean, take the example of pricing. These days, if you want to see a credit derivative price, you can do so. But at the same time, if you want to see what's really happening in the equity markets, particularly in the US, but not just in the US, in fact, an awful lot of that activity has been quietly sliding off into what they call dark pools. Dark pools is actually a journalist's gift. Sounds like something out of Star Trek, equity markets are sliding into dark pools. But essentially what it means is that you have these markets happening where ordinary people who aren't inside the group can't see what's happening, they can't see the prices. Similarly, if you look at the structure of finance and see where power's concentrated and ask yourself, is it any less of a cartel than it was a decade ago? In some respects it is, in other respects it isn't. Progress has at best been very mixed in terms of remembering those Adam Smith principles. And to my mind, what's actually even more important is that if you raise your eyes beyond finance, which is what I looked at a lot a decade ago, and look across at the rest of the business world, you can see echoes of this same pattern and problem, this same, if you like, hypocrisy in other sectors. I mean, one of the areas that I'm absolutely fascinated by these days is tech, Silicon Valley. In my job, my day job as sort of overseeing the Financial Times in America, I spend a certain amount of time over on the West Coast. And when I go around the big tech companies and hear those new masters of the tech universe talk about what they're doing, I get goosebumps because it sounds exactly like bankers back in 2006. Once again, you have got a small group of excessively well-paid, wealthy elites who are doing something that almost nobody else in the rest of society really understands. Speaking a language that isn't medieval Latin, isn't bankerese, this time it's cyber jargon, engaged in a craft that they believe with evangelical fervor is going to make the world better. And remember, bankers back in 2006, they also thought that they were making the world better, or at least that's how they wrapped it up in terms of their rhetorical wrappings for what they were doing. But tech sector has got this elite, well-paid elite, cut off, thinking they're doing well, operating once again under the flag of Adam Smith, under the flag of free markets, libertarianism. And yet, you start digging into how they're actually operating. You start asking whether they really recognize the need for regulation and judicial frameworks. You start asking whether the people who are creating these new technologies really understand the end implications who are thinking about humans. You ask about access. You look at whether the big tech giants are actually encouraging new competitors or killing them off and buying them as fast as they can and creating monopolies. You think about the type of power monopolies that groups like Facebook, Google have over specific technological platforms. And you think about prices. And what's interesting about the tech world today is actually it's not so much monetary prices anymore that matter. Not everything tech companies are doing with consumers can be exchanged in prices. So when you actually give your data to Google, you don't actually get money back. What you get back instead is access to a service. You get access to the ability to use the web. There's an exchange going on, but it's not expressed in payment, which, by the way, has very interesting questions for how you think of economics these days or issues like productivity. But when you think about that kind of exchange that's going on and say, well, are those exchanges able to be seen by a wider group of people? Can everyone who's looking at that kind of market for non-monetary exchanges, can they track them? Can they work out the value? Or is that information once again held by a tiny elite? You see a lot of echoes. So my sermon, apologies, thank you for listening. My sermon basically is that we need a Reformation. I personally am proud to call myself someone who believes in capitalism. I believe in market forces. Having lived in the former Soviet Union, or lived in the Soviet Union when it was a Soviet Union, I've seen what socialist planning is and can do, and I actually prefer the market. But I give to you as my Reformation this: a free market that operates under the banner or flag of a free market, but actually ignores most of the 6 key principles that Adam Smith laid out, is not just bad, it's often worse than some of the alternatives. If we want to have a free market that we can feel proud of, we need to go back to the original gospel of Adam Smith